see all of you. Right? My name is Coach Bodie. I've kind of been here at CRI for the last 6 or 7 years. Matt Lair and myself usually do some of this coaching education stuff. So each month we try to select some sort of a topic, and we always try to pick. I guess we're kind of working on a theme. How many people know they're coming for that what works sort of thing? Anybody?
Raise my hand.
Sweet. Yeah, okay, cool. That should be kind of neat. And it's, of course, Crash Me Weekend, which is also kind of fun. So I think so one of the things that we have been finding, at least Matt and myself, over the last couple of years of sort of working in the coaching education stuff is, we used to do these kinds of little get-togethers actually weekly. We had like an in-house session for like CRI coaches. This was like 5 years ago. And then at some point, obviously you just start talking about similar issues over and over and over again. So we went to a 1 month, every month format, and then we just started to do them just in the seasons, trying to keep people engaged in it. And so what we'd like to do with tonight is, Noel's amazingly sort of gotten himself up here. We had Dave Snowden as well, but Dave was ultra sick for the last 2 to 3 days. He like sent me an email this morning and he said, I'm kind of even having trouble just like standing out of bed and stuff. So we would have had Dave with us. But what I hope to do with tonight is to prime some discussion. And, Noel's got some interesting thoughts and ideas about rigging. And maybe, the idea is for this to be very sort of like dialogue, like roundtable discussion. So if there are things that pop up in your head or questions that you've had or things that, I know for myself, like I'm a novice girls coach, so one of the number one things I'm really concerned about is making sure that the rig on the boat is as light a load as possible for us to go as fast as we need to. So from my point of view, like I'm always trying to figure out a way to make the rig a little bit lighter so that we can reduce the total load on young people's bodies. Right, so for me, that's kind of like my point of view, my perspective. That's where I'm coming from. So the more information I can gather about that, the better. And I'm still a pretty novice rigger. I work with introductory level athletes for the most part, and I don't work with super high performance, high power people. So I'm assuming that it's going to sort of bring me to a different place. So please, we're going to just keep it going, and the little worksheet that you have, hopefully some thoughts pop up into your head about maybe what you were coming here to sort of figure out, and hopefully we can sort of help each other out. Okay, so and also there's a little note on there too that I really think is the idea that you guys have all come here to sort of be part of like a collaborative process, to sort of be part of like an exchange of thoughts and ideas, because I think the bigger picture for all of us in this room is that we wish that rowing and coaching rowing, we had possibilities and opportunities all over the world to coach, to row, to raise the level so that you could earn a living by being a professional rowing coach. That's kind of like what we're trying to do, is just keep that moving forward. And so just by you guys being here to share ideas is part of that effort, which is super nice. Okay. And so this is Noel Wanner. I actually just met Noel really tonight, but I've heard of Noel quite a bit. He's good friends with Kane, from what I understand. So if you just want to just start it off, and then we'll
Sure.
kind of get it going.
So, hi everybody. My name is Noel Wanner. I'm the men's coach at Tufts University. I was the men's and women's coach at Middlebury College for a long time, like 7 years. And I spent a lot of time up in the woods watching people row on a really beautiful lake up there called Lake Dunmore. If you ever get a chance to get up there, it's well worth checking out as a cool place to row. But what it is very far away from this place, and very far away from the center of the world of rowing and the center of coaching. And I spent a lot of time up there by myself watching crews row and working with middle to low-level D3 athletes, trying to make them go faster. So a lot of my thoughts on rigging have come from thinking about how to try to get the most out of people who are not, people who are normal-sized. People who are not gargantuan, normal-sized humans.
Theo, don't stand up, Theo.
And so a lot of my thinking about rigging has been to try to say, okay, if presuming that it would be genetically useful to be 6'6" as a guy and have a huge long wingspan, why is that in rowing? Like, why is it advantageous to be tall? And what can we do for those of us who are not that tall to help us to go a little faster, row with a little bit more effectiveness, and just to have a little bit more fun and hopefully maybe be more competitive against the tall trees. Part of that maybe comes from my background. I rowed at D3 school, I rowed at Wesleyan in college, and then I was a lightweight on the national team for a little while. So I sort of have a long history myself of not being 6'6". So I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. The other thing to think about rigging that's interesting is in rowing is that we don't really think about rigging a whole lot. And the rigging numbers that we use are pretty old, most of them, and pretty much the same across the board. And when I stopped rowing competitively, I started cycling competitively. It was really interesting going from the world of rowing to the world of cycling. And cyclists are just obsessed with the rigging, if you want to call it that, of their tool, which is the bike, right? Anybody who's purchased a high-end bike in the last 20 years has seen how much goes into that process, right? How many different sizes of frame there are. Keep letting this go to sleep. How many different sizes of frame there are, how many different options there are in terms of fitting the tool to the athlete, okay? Yeah, do you need this or?
No. If you just click on the little square next to the Wi-Fi.
All right.
Yeah,
That'll get me back. All right, good. There we go. So I'm just going to run this so it doesn't go to sleep. So I basically sort of thought it was really interesting that athletes don't, or that rowing in particular doesn't seem to have as many options for athletes of different sizes, right? We've seen like the difference in a bike frame for a 6'6" guy and a 5'2", 50-year-old woman. Those are really, really different bikes, down to everything like the size of the crank arm, the size of the lever arm that they use to provide propulsive force, the size of the frame, but really different, right? In the world of rowing, we still don't have that. Right? We still don't have that amount of difference in boats, in rigging. I think if you were to think about it proportionally, instead of having, if you were looking for a boat for 5'6" people, you would have a much smaller hull and you would have much, much tighter spread, right? If it was going to be proportional, and you would have much smaller oars, much shorter oars. It's interesting that you were talking about wanting to get the rig light enough for your novice girls, right? I think almost everybody in the world of rowing is rigged too heavy. I think that we use a lot of rigging numbers that are old, and we use a lot of rigging numbers that were established for big, tall, male athletes. And we don't deviate a whole lot from that, right? How many people as singles are spread at 160, right? A lot, right? A lot of people. I coach at Craftsbury in the summertime, and we have all our boats are like 159, 160, right? And we have a lot of small athletes, right? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. The other thing about the reason that I think having proportional rigging is really important is because there's a lot of efficiency that's gained or lost in terms of how the boat is rigged. And that's why I sort of wanted to have this little video clip up here, which I stole from our women's coach. But I don't know, anybody recognize this video? Okay, there's YouTube, the world of rowing on YouTube. There's those Heroes series. This is the one on the Sinkovich brothers. And like about 9 minutes into this sort of otherwise kind of goofy video that's sort of like, okay, we're big, strong guys, we train a lot. There's this little tiny like 3-second shot taken from overhead from like a bridge abutment or something. And I just thought it was really, really interesting because you can see how much, look at that, right? Like, that's insane, right? That's so much catch angle, right? Like, is it possible to have too much catch angle? It's a good, interesting question, right? Why, and it gets back to my beginning point, which is, why is it good to be tall in rowing, right? Why is it good to have long arms proportional for your height, right? Everybody is probably familiar with that idea, right? Or has seen athletes that are smaller, but because they have longer arms for their height, they're able to go faster, right? They're able to be more effective. And it has something to do with this. If you want to watch it, and you watch what the blades do, right? Watch the direction that the blades go as the drive begins, right? As the blade goes in the water, boom, blades are in. Which way do they go? Whoa! They go a long way towards the finish line, right? there's a lot of stuff going on the face of the blade as it goes in the water like this, okay? So, this idea of pinching the boat, which hopefully has gone the way of the dodo, I think should go the way of the dodo, still sticks around, and if you look at smaller athletes, they're not usually rowing and getting that much catch angle, right? If it's good for these guys, why shouldn't it be good for smaller athletes, right? The idea is that there's something useful happening with the blade going in the water in a moving system, right? If I'm in the boat and I'm trucking along this way, and I put the blade in the water at a nice steep catch angle, the velocity of my system moving along, blade goes sliding towards the finish line, something's happening in the water on the face of the blade that is useful for generating boat speed, right? There's utility that comes from getting a lot of catch angle and from getting the blade in the water, right? Everybody who's coached for any length of time or has been coached as an athlete, right? What's the repetitive refrain? Get the goddamn blade in the water, right? Get it in, right? Why? Why does it matter, right? It matters because of something that's going on between the blade and the water in a moving system at a nice steep catch angle. It also matters because that's when you have the chance to use your legs, right? We spend all this time training physiologically, right? What do we train? Train a lot of leg strength. We train a lot of cardiovascular stuff, right? So you want to be able to use your legs, and you also want to be able to use your cardiovascular system. And when it's done well, it looks like running over the water. It doesn't look like moving water, right? I remember where I read this quote from Michel Gorette a long time ago. It said, when I started sculling, I was just a strong animal getting tired, and eventually I became able to run over the surface of the water, right? Mm-hmm. And the feeling when you have it rigged right is that you're connected and that the system moves past the blade, right? And that's another thing that this is useful for watching, because the system goes hauling ass past where the blade goes in, and there's not a whole lot of movement of the blade that way at all, right? The water isn't giving way, right? He's got connection, right? Another word that coaches use all the time, connection to the water, right? Do you ever want the blade to slip, right? Who swims, right? Anybody swim, right? I have 4-year-old and 3-year-old daughters, and I spent a lot of time this winter trying to teach them both how to swim, and they're really inefficient in their swimming, and they smack the water a lot. And they don't really hold their hands in such a way to get an efficient grip on the water, right? So they flail and they move a lot of water. Like I get splashed a lot. They don't move a whole lot, right? They sort of do this. They kind of hit the water with an open hand or a fist, or their hands all kind of all over the place. There's no efficient connection between the paddle of their hand to move the water, right? I read an article a long time ago in the New York Times Magazine, I think, about why Michael Phelps was so perfectly sort of biologically and genetically suited for swimming. And there were all these different sort of proportions of his body that made him really good at moving through the water. And one of them was his feet and hands were enormous for his size, right? And they had pictures of his hands and his feet, and they're just gigantic, right? So he's getting a more efficient connection with the fluid that he's trying to push past, right? He's trying to get an efficient connection to that, that substance so that he can move past, right? Because the goal is not to move water, the goal is to move yourself. Right? The other thing is like running in sand, right? Everybody run in sand, really hard, right? It's hard because you slip, right? You're not able to get an efficient push off, okay? So all of these are just ideas that I kind of explored, and that all made me start thinking, well, like, I want this connection to be as efficient as possible. I want to get as much catch angle as I can out of myself or my athletes so that I can take advantage of what's going on the blade here that's advantageous, right? There's something about the physics of how this blade moves in the water, right? People talk about lift forces being generated right here. All of these things kind of combine together so that if you're doing this, right, if you're getting this nice catch angle, right, the perceived load that you're going to feel is a lot heavier because of, if you buy the idea of lift forces being generated in the blade, that's something that you're pushing against as you start to try to move the system. And it's also just a point where you've got a very efficient connection to the water, and so it's going to feel heavier. You have to rig appropriately in order to get the gearing, the feeling that the athlete has moving through the water, to be light enough so that you can make rowing aerobic again. Okay, that's the other thing I think about people. People are rigged too heavy. the athletes can change how they move in order to deal with a rig that's too heavy. How do they change how they move? They shorten up their stroke. They stop getting the blade in the water at the most efficient point, right? You know, you've all seen that crews that get tired and they sort of lose it, and then all of a sudden they start missing water, and they start trying to move the boat in the back end of the stroke rather than being able to use the legs, right? And all of those things are lost if you're not getting the blade in, right? All of the advantages of being able to use your legs, the big levers that move the system, and if you buy the idea that there's something useful going on in the face of the blade, by putting the blade in a nice steep angle, all those things are lost as soon as the athlete feels like the load is too heavy. They can't manage it. In order to keep the rate up, they're going to shorten up somehow. Okay? Everybody sees that happen and has probably felt it in their own rowing. Okay? The other thing, let's see. The other thing about rigging is just comfort, right? Yeah, there we go. Okay, everybody's probably familiar with this picture, right? Mm-hmm. Dutch 8 in 96. Just looks so super easy and comfortable. Right? A quality of movement that is not about, they don't look like they're trying to attack the water. They don't look like they're trying to do much of anything. They just look like they're kind of coiling up the levers of their body in a comfortable position, and then being able to just drop the blade in the water so they can get some purchase on the substance and then move past. This is a picture I just wanted to show because it brings up another idea that I think about a lot when I'm rigging my crews, which is, are you putting your athlete in a position where they can feel comfortable and they can be effective, right? Everybody is proportioned really differently. This is another thing that you experience if you ever do like a bike fitting, right? People are proportioned hugely differently even at the same height, right? Different torso length, different leg length, different parts of the leg are different lengths in different people. And that has a really big effect on what position you get put in here at the catch, if you can even get into this position, right? And the idea is to be in something like this position so that you can just unfold the levers of the body comfortably and effectively without putting sort of undue strain on your body, right? Different conversations about what the sort of shape of the spine should be like. As a rower, I experienced a disc injury from rowing with a load that was way too heavy. Probably another reason that I like thinking about rigging this way. I was on the national team at the time when the hatchet blades were first coming into favor, and I rowed for a coach who sort of bought the hatchet blades at exactly the same length that we've been rowing the Macon blades at, and this is a national team coach. Okay, so we're like crushing 20-minute AT pieces up and down this river out here with a massive, massive load, right? Because they just thought, oh, this is nonsense that we're putting, we're asking the coaches to cut the blade down, cut the length of the oar down 10 centimeters or more, okay? This position looks pretty comfortable, right? Athletes are comfortable. You don't see that a lot of, if you don't have really high-level athletes, you see a lot of uncomfortable people, right? And the question is the discomfort their fault or your fault, right? Or are there things that you can do to help them a little bit, right? Obviously, flexibility plays a big issue, right? And being able to kind of do this kind of hip rotation right here without an undue sort of rounding of the lower spine. I saw a lot of athletes whose torso length or shin length was causing problems, right? Either the torso is really long, so you see athletes who look like they're having trouble with body control at the catch, and they're kind of falling out over their rigger or falling down. Sometimes that's just bad posture, that's just lack of core strength, that's lack of discipline or understanding of the need for that body control. But sometimes it's made harder if you have an athlete with a really long torso and their knees are sort of down here. They have this feeling that they can just reach out infinitely, right? And the temptation to overreach is really, really great. So I had some pretty good success with athletes like that by just raising the feet up as much as I could do it, right? Just trying to put them in something like this so that you got to the point where their knees were coming up high enough that it was actually hard for them to overreach, right? Conversely, I had a lot of athletes, often guys who had really long legs and pretty short torsos. And they look, these were people who ended up looking like they were, their butts were tucking up under at the catch, or they were not getting sufficient body angle, right? So that they sort of looked like they were rowing with legs and arms only. And I had a lot of success just by dropping the feet down a lot, right? And then lifting the seat up a little bit if you had to, if the feet couldn't drop down enough. And all of it was just to try to get the picture to look right. I'm not a huge numbers obsessive. I'm not a huge math guy. I want to put the athlete in a comfortable position so that they can row effectively and fast and injury-free and have a good time. Okay, so all of it was sort of having an idea in my head about what I kind of wanted the position to look like, and then seeing, okay, are there things that I can do right off the bat with sort of individualizing the rig in order to help people get that nice efficient catch angle that I was talking about, right? That nice reach around the pin, okay? And then also to help them put their bodies in a position so that they can apply force effectively, right? So that they can apply force quickly and effectively. And all this sort of comes out of my experience of rowing with rigs that were too heavy, rowing with rigs that got me hurt. Just realizing that there's a long way to go still in terms of both what we as coaches can do and sort of think about doing, and then also what's available from the manufacturers, right? I've worked with a number of different boat manufacturers and had them make me riggers that were shorter, right? The riggers that allowed me to row with tighter spreads so that I could get the catch angle that I wanted with smaller athletes, right? And as I did that, the oars got shorter and shorter and shorter, okay? And at Tufts, at least right now, we're still experimenting, and I haven't found the limit to how short becomes too short.
Have you looked at bioroad.com as far as their beta versus traditional?
Yeah, I like Kleshnev's stuff a lot, and I think he's sort of on the right track. I mean, that calculator produces some wacky numbers sometimes, and I sort of use that. I've used that and sort of kind of plugged in my numbers as well and sort of seeing where it comes out. I think ultimately the only thing to do is to try to measure speed a little bit, right? To sort of, if you have a crew and you have enough of a set lineup that you can experiment a little bit without changing the variables too much, you can change something and then actually test to see if it makes you faster, right? Because that's, I think we were sort of, one of the topics for tonight was like, can you rig in such a way that it'll actually make your crew faster, and how can you tell, right?
Yeah, I think that would be something to sort of, because we're probably really more limited by actually what we have access to, right? So like I'm a novice coach. I kind of inherit whatever the varsity team was using 5 years ago, and so like so I've got fatty blades. I've even tried to modify the oars to get them even shorter because we know that the blade is really big, and then trying to give them a little bit more leverage by going to 86 or so, 86 and a half, whatever I can get the pin to go to. Right, just to sort of try to give them just a little bit more, leverage on the pen. But
just to give people a little bit of an idea, like for a while when I was coaching at Middlebury, we rode force, and we started using the Fat 2 blade, and I had men's force at 365, and now I have a men's 8 that's rowing at 362, and we've gone lighter and lighter and tighter, and the boat keeps going faster. So I don't your mileage may vary. I'm not saying you should try to do what I do. This is all predicated, of course, on trying to teach your athletes to actually get the blade in the water at the right moment, right? If you have athletes that can't do that, then maybe you need to think about doing something different. And sometimes you sort of reach that point as a coach of kind of like, well, the racing season is here. We're not really doing a really good job of getting the blade in where we need to. Maybe we need to think about trying to move the boat through the middle of the stroke a little bit more, and maybe that means that we have to sort of go back to a more conventional looking rig. But if again, this is my coaching points of emphasis is this, right? The drop of the blade, right? Let the blade go in the water at the right time so that you can use all of the levers that you've got, right? You are whatever you are physically, right? You've trained as much as you've trained. You're as tall as you are. Your levers are as long as they are. That's not really going to change. What you can change is making sure that the blade goes in the water so that you can actually move the boat through the whole length of your levers unfolding. Okay? And if you do that, then the boat tends to go a little faster. If you do that and you're rigged tight and you're putting your athletes in a position where they're getting something that resembles that catch angle that I showed first thing, the load is going to feel heavy, right? So you got to lighten up a lot. But if you're missing it, it's like there's nothing there, right? Athletes that miss that moment, they've missed the opportunity to move the boat through a lot of different ways because they've missed the nice physics of the blade in the water sliding and generating the lift force on the face of the blade. They've also missed the opportunity to move with the most powerful levers, right? And you end up with this big yank at the back. And I have a number of athletes who are really great on the erg, and they just can't seem to figure it out on the water because they can't get the skill and the timing. It's really about timing the blade to drop it in so that you can actually move the boat. Okay, and sometimes it's, I don't know, you started, I think one of your questions was like, what's one of your biggest rigging disasters?
Right.
I know there was a year I had a crew, we just couldn't figure it out, right? We were just not going very fast. It took me a long time to realize that they just weren't going to get it in time for the races that we were doing, and I needed to just lengthen them out, spread them out, let them just hammer through the middle, and that worked a lot better, and they went a lot faster because that was that crew, and they sort of we'd run out of time to get the technical aspect. All of the stuff in rigging is interconnected, and sometimes you're kind of forced to make compromises that are not ideally what you want. And a lot of it is dependent on the skill and the abilities of your athletes, the sizes of your athletes, the flexibility of your athletes. Okay, so that's sort of a quick kind of overview of where I come from on rigging. I really wish that, and I say this all the time to the boat manufacturers and the oar manufacturers, I wish we had more options, right? Because I think as we have more options to play with, we're going to be able to discover more. The one thing I would say is don't be afraid to try things that are different. I found both as an athlete and as a coach that there's a tremendous sort of conservatism in rowing. I think coaches, especially almost like the higher level you go to, the more they don't want to try something different. They want to be the same as just about everybody else because they worry that if they try something different and it doesn't work, that it's going to be their ass on the line. That was the other great thing I found about working way up in the middle of the woods is that nobody knew or cared what I was doing, and so and we were terribly slow to start out with. So I was like, well, there's really no reason not to try something different. And I hope to preserve that spirit of experimentation as long as I'm coaching because I just think it's more fun, and I think we're far away from knowing everything. I think that as soon as you think you know everything, you're in big trouble. So I definitely don't know everything, and I feel like we're on the right track with what we're doing. I feel like it works pretty well for me with the way that I coach. But I know that there's a lot of other coaches who make boats go fast doing different stuff. So the one thing that I would say is that I wish we had more options, and I think that there's speed and pleasure for the athletes to be gained from rigging a little bit more attentively. Okay.
And so in terms of like moving toward like that idea of like how would we know what the optimal gearing is? So far we've been using data that just comes from other stuff that's fairly old, probably based on making blades to some degree. Like so where in terms of just running like point to point, and it's obviously hard to do back-to-back testing if you're doing, because then you have athletes that get tired, especially younger ones that are not really that fit. Like you can't just keep going 6-minute pieces over and over to try different. I've even tried to go back-to-back with different kinds of oars, and you get maybe one or two, and the third, forget it. Like it's like it's not even close.
Yeah, trying to get an organized experiment and a control, to control enough variables that it even means anything is really, really hard to do. Yeah. I'm sort of what I was saying before about rigging being a really complicated set of problems that are also interacting with the athletes. Right. And the more athletes you have in the boat, the more complex that gets too. Yeah. And then if you have younger or less experienced athletes, they're not going to be as consistent. Yeah, very. Right. At that point, I think collecting data and looking at data on a regular basis so you can notice trends. At least what I do is I just try to collect speed data all the time and look at it all the time so that I can see, okay, something was different. What was different, right? Okay. Is something different about the technical stuff that we're doing? Is there something different about where we are in the fitness cycle? Does the rigging change that we've made, is that making a difference? And again, like I said, I'm not a huge math guy, and I definitely, there's an element of coaching, I think, that is about sort of a subjective art, too, which is sort of comes from experience and watching a lot of rowing or sculling and sort of getting a sense of what you think a good moving boat looks like. it's one of the things that I do a lot when I go to regattas. If my crews are done, or if I don't have a crew at that regatta, I want to watch the fast crews, because I want to see what does it look like when a boat's really moving well, right? And I think what's one of the great blessings of YouTube and sort of living in this generation is that you can actually watch a lot of video of a lot of different crews, and a lot of different crews training too. Like normally, you watch people at a race and you're watching from a great distance. It's kind of hard to get a sense of what's going on. One of the things that I have done for a while now is coach at Craftsbury in the summer times. And when I first was coaching up there, I would go up there and coach for like 6 weeks straight or 8 weeks straight, and that is just a crap load of scullers, right? So you're cycling through 35 to 40 scullers. The week program comes in for 6 days, they leave, another group comes in for the weekend, they leave, and you're just cycling through. So in the course of 2 months of coaching up there, I could see hundreds of scullers, right? And then over the course of the better part of a decade, watching a whole lot of sculling, good, bad, and everything in between, and you start to see some things about how boats look when they're moving well, regardless of sort of athlete size or ability. That was the other thing that was kind of illuminating to me, was seeing really tiny, weak scullers at Craftsbury who could just kick the crap out of big, strong athletes. And the question was how and why, right? Like, a 13-year-old junior girl hops in a single for the first time in her life, and 5 days later is beating master scullers who've been sculling for 15 years, big, strong guys. Why? How? Has nothing to do with power. It has something to do with how she's moving in the boat and her relationship to the moving system, right? So the question is, can you watch that and see what's really going on, or see at least the characteristics of what a boat looks like when it's moving well, right?
Bodie? Could I
Yeah,
interject
please, yeah.
one quick thing?
Yeah, you guys can all
So
chime in.
I think your original question was, is there an optimal catch angle, say, for instance?
Right.
And I think Kleshnev has graphs that have pretty much concluded that in sculling at least 70 degrees is the best catch angle, and his graph will show a decrement in speed if you go to 75 or if you go to 65. So I think at least in sculling, he's got that information, which is based on lots of measurements over time. And I think he has the same thing for sweep rowing. So I think that's something that I would shoot for,
That's
at least in
the start.
sculling.
Yeah,
It's a
right.
70 catch angle, and it's hard to get unless you're 6'3" plus and super flexible with the normal equipment that we have.
Right.
Well, and that's it's interesting, because like if you look at what the calculations would say that smaller athletes should row at, the kinds of spreads that they should row at, there are no riggers that there are no riggers that will let you go to 152, right? Which is if you're 5'4", you should probably be rowing at 150, right? And the oars should be super short, right? And we don't even get to try that, right?
What's fascinating about that comment is that you've just described para rowing.
Yeah,
Right.
Oars are short.
Yeah.
The rigging can go, very, very tight.
Right.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Well, and I think the question of rigging also kind of tied rigging and this idea of rigging lighter and tighter. It's like, well, what is rowing requiring in terms of the energy systems, right? It's an aerobic sport primarily, right? Even for at least for a 2K distance, it's largely aerobic, right? And some disagreement about exactly what the proportion is, but it's still very, very aerobic. Yeah, it helps to be big and strong, but you have to be able to sustain that, right? So, again, just from personal experience, rigging lighter so that the athletes can sort of row higher ratings comfortably. People talk about spinning their wheels. I see crews that spin their wheels because they don't get the catches in at the right time. I don't see crews that are spinning their wheels because the rig is necessarily too light, right?
What are your thoughts on a mixed boat and rigging?
Oh, men and women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, let's say a mixed 4 at an elite level.
Let's say.
Casually, just randomly. And with specifics to that, would you emphasize the stroke length through the water with all 4 people, or the handle speed, or catch angles?
I mean, again, there's a lot of coaches like to do things different ways, and a lot of coaches that like to match up release angles because they feel like it helps the send of the boat and the set of the boat.
Mm-hmm.
I've kind of gone the other way, and I try to center around catch angle, again, because of sort of where I started with the first illustration, and sort of this belief that I have that there's something really useful happening when you put the blade in at that nice steep, 70-degree angle or whatever it is, which, as you say, feels, 70 degrees feels like parallel, right? If you actually are rowing and you're trying to do that, and you're not 6'7" and you don't have an arm span that goes out to the sides of the room, it's a pretty tough thing to do unless you're rigged appropriately.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, in the first crew I had at Tufts last year, we were like, those supposed heavyweight crew, our average weight was 167 pounds, and we were, 5'11" on average or something like that. Again, and much shorter people than that in the bow of the boat, some 5'9" guys up in there, and I just, I try to match them up out here, right? I make them go with their foot stretcher to the stern as far as I can to try to get them out here over the side of the rigger. I try to bring those guys in. What you're describing about the mixed boat is just the challenges of radically different sized athletes, and that can happen in same gender boats too.
Yeah.
I had a women's four that had a 6'1" woman rowing next to a 5'4" woman, and the question was, how can they be a pair that's going to be effective? And you do. I mean, again, don't be afraid to just push the big person way out, right? To kind of diminish some of their. Basically, you're making some sacrifices to perhaps the great efficiency of that biggest athlete in order to get something that's going to match up, so that the boat will at least be somewhat rowable, right? Because everyone's probably seen that when you're watching, right, from the coaching launch, and you watch from behind the boat, and you have one athlete who's just going way out here, and their stroke is just so much longer than these short little choppy strokes. So you got to fix that somehow, right?
And so your thing would be catch angles.
Yeah, catch angles and just sort of playing with the spreads in order to try to match up the total arc, right?
Okay.
To try to match the total arc a little bit better. And you're talking about trade-offs, right? You don't want to sacrifice all of the length of your taller athlete just to get the angles to be the same, but you need the taller athlete to be able to get through the water at the same time as the smaller athletes. And if they're rigged exactly the same way, they're just not going to have a chance, right? And especially if they're trying to follow smaller athletes, right? If you have smaller athletes in the stern pair, which often happens, right? It can be really tough if you've got a big size differential. So I think you have to try to meet in the middle somewhere. And again, I am not completely scientific in my approach to this. I trust my eye a little bit, and then I also want to look at speed data over time. Because I sort of, as you were saying before, I find that doing controllable experiments is very, very hard with collegiate crews, because they're tired and busy, and just getting enough water time with them is pretty tough. Trying to create a controllable environment. So
cool.
I'm Peter Wilhelm, there against boat clubs. What I do is I rig the boat first for the arc that I want to go through, in the sense of inboard and spreader. Sometimes I'm stuck spread or span, and sometimes I'm stuck with what you can do as far as pulling it in. Oftentimes if the kid's smaller, I don't worry about how close the hands. Like a lot of times you'll read hands got to brush the body. I don't necessarily do that. If I want the inboard shorter to get the arc through, I might give up that. And so I go for the arc, and then after that, what I do is I go for the outboard. So I shorten down, or I set the outboard for the stroke rating that I want. So in other words, I look at them row. If they can only row at a 22, I want a shorter outboard so that I can bring the stroke rating up. And I talked to a German biomechanics person that works for the national team, and they did testing, lactate testing, and speed testing, and what they found was that it works better when you rig the boat individually as opposed to setting everybody the same. So that, so like when I rig a boat, if I have two different size people in it, I'll rig
for each of them.
I'll rig the spread and oar length for each individual.
I have one more thing to add to that question, which is I think it's difficult, and I think you could take the point of view, well, we'll compromise at the catch angle and we'll also compromise at the finish angle. So just trying to make the best of it. That would be one approach.
Yeah.
I think one approach that would be worth trying would be to try to get everyone at the same catch angle, roughly as much as possible. A steep catch angle, I think that's the most important.
Yeah.
And then realizing that the taller people, they can come out of the water whenever they need to.
Yeah,
So if
yeah.
the short people are done, the tall people can just come out.
Yeah.
And then the final thing would be to make sure everyone's in the water for the same duration. You can
Yep.
time it on a slow motion video or something.
Yeah.
So I'd say catch angle, the tall people can come out anywhere during the stroke, and then just make sure everyone's in the water about the same amount of time. That would be my
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah.
And I think that's right, because if you're going to give some part of the stroke away, give up stuff back here where you've got the big levers are already done.
Yeah.
You're giving up the stuff that's happening with smaller muscle groups and less efficient blade mechanics. If you buy that once it's past a certain angle of attack, you get past perpendicular, and the models of what's going on in the face of the blade get pretty sloppy. So to me that says, you want to be, you want your crew to be in at a nice steep angle, and then if you have to someplace past perpendicular, if you just got to take it out just to match up the time, then that can work well.
Or you may be able to give that one individual who's quite the outlier, whoever that might be, a slightly different lever in terms of their oar, their specific oar. Like a lot of times on the novice crew, like I'll give someone who's really lanky and tall and not really strong a couple of clans, because it gets her through the water at a similar speed to the ones that are a little bit smaller.
Yeah.
Just to give her a little more leverage. But
Cool.
yeah, that's for sure.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
I have another question that has to do with oar length.
Yes.
So one advantage, I think, of long oars is that it keeps the athlete's feet and hips and the handle and the blade all at roughly flat, right? So if I were the boat, this were the pin, this were the oar, and the water were about here. Long oars, it's staying flat, and as soon as you start to bring this in, at a certain point you bring it in enough that the stroke becomes this really kind of it's at different levels where the parts of the system are moving. The pin is now, the oar angle is like that,
So
as opposed to this.
haul.
I don't know if that's something
Yeah,
that
so
people
then your
even think
long
about.
oar is going to be like this, and then your short oar is going to be more like that.
And
that would
yeah.
change.
I mean, it does. There is an effect the effect that you're just describing, and you can mitigate it a little bit by just dropping the height of the pin down. Right?
Oh yeah.
Right.
So this way.
You drop the pin down, and I definitely have done that as I've seen that start to happen. The funny thing though is that I think that there is something about that long, flat, sweeping stroke that we just find kind of familiar and traditional and comforting. And I had a women's crew one year that was very, very small, and we were going to go to the Dadvale, and I was like, well, they just need to be able to rate higher, and they're strong and fit, but they just are not very big. And so I just slammed their riggers as far in as I could get, and I had a set of skinnies that I got put down as short as we could go. I think 362 or 361 or whatever, and then just they looked like what you're describing, and it went really fast. And they didn't seem to feel uncomfortable, once they got used to it. And there's this funny thing I think of athletes' expectations, right? And it's this whole question of what you tell athletes and what you don't. Right? It's like the Princess and the Pea phenomenon. And I had an assistant coach just recently write me saying, why, he said, when I coached for you, I noticed that you withheld some information from your athletes sometimes. Why would you do that? Isn't there sort of a teachable moment that you're missing there? And I said, yeah, there is sometimes, but sometimes, athletes are nervous before competitions, or, they just want predictable things, even if they are not necessarily the right things, right? And so there sometimes is something to be said for a sort of autocratic, or not even autocratic, but just not even telling them, right? Like I didn't tell my men's crew last year that we were rigged lighter than the women's crew at Tufts.
Did you wind up bringing the rigger or the oar lock down?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
And again, it was it was sort of a desperation situation, because it was like 2 weeks before Vails, and I was like, well, we're not going to be able to make the final there unless we can rate 36, 37 at least. And so I just slammed him in and down, and took a look, and all of a sudden things started to take off, and they look good.
So you tried to make it you made it as horizontal as you could. given
Yeah,
your-
because I felt like it was, at a certain point, it feels like it's hard to find the water. I think once
Yeah.
you're, just like
Yeah.
as the angle what you have to reach at gets steeper, your handle height has to go pretty high. And you don't want to feel like you're a million miles from the water, right? You want to feel like you can get the blade in without having to make some drastic movement. So,
The girl that won the head of Charles was using 285 oars this year. The girl that came in second was using 268.
260. Wow, yeah.
yeah. Well, and I think there is something to be said for like if you have athletes that are just super strong, but not necessarily super skilled. You can rig heavier and longer and just row through the middle, right? Like.
Well, the girl at 268, she was small, so she was maybe 115 pounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
CV?
I was just gonna say, so in theory, like for Theo's point, you would have oars that you could adjust the angle of the blade.
Huh.
Yeah, I
Right?
thought of that.
Yeah.
That's what
Well,
you want.
they absolutely.
Oh, you mean like out here?
Yeah.
Well,
you
yeah.
could
make
get
it-
really short.
and this
or-
So you could get a blade that would go parallel
The-
to the
the-
water.
and this,
Oh, wow.
You actually bring up
Like,
something
where's
really
the-
interesting, which I've always sort of dreamed of, is the ability to have it or where the angle of the blade in the horizontal plane could change through the
Right,
stroke.
this way.
Because,
But
again, getting back to the swimming idea, if you notice what you do when you swim, as you go through the stroke, you're
You have to
changing
change.
the angle of attack of your blade, your
Right.
hand, right? The foil, the wing, whatever it is, you're changing it in order to, because you feel
To
when it
find
starts
more
to slip,
water.
you're trying to find more connection and diminish slip, right? And part of what's happening with these blades is that good angle of attack, kind of nice sort of efficient, drag forces that you create through perpendicular, but then as you start to go through here, the angle of attack gets really bad, and you'd actually like to sort of wrist it back this
But
way
I
and
was
sort
talking
of
about the other angle.
yeah,
Yeah, this
Yep.
way.
Yeah, but both would be,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Another
no,
project for Dave.
Yeah, Dave, get on that.
Well, actually, at the
I
catch. Okay, sorry. Go
One
ahead.
quick thing to add to some of this discussion about the blade angles. I think within the limits of the available equipment, if you did the calculations, I suspect that the actual angle would vary in quite a small way, probably less than 5 degrees, if we're talking about the angle that the shaft makes with the water. So I think we're talking about very small angles.
Right.
And then I would say if the blade gets too long and it's too shallow an angle, then to get the blade in the water, a good proportion of your shaft is going to have to be in the water also, which then is not good as you try to take it out. On the other hand, I've always been amazed how fast some crews will go, and literally they're burying their shafts halfway up, and they're winning.
yeah.
So
Power.
Well, and it's interesting. And if you've been rowing for the last 25 years or more, it's like the kinds of oars that we're using have changed a lot, right? In terms of the length, right? And think about how long and flat were the sweep oars 25 years ago, pretty long and pretty flat, right? And now at least some crews are using oars that are a lot shorter and that are a lot, that's the other thing I think that is important to think about rigging is that athletes can adapt to a lot, right? Athletes will figure out, it's a biomechanical relationship, right? So they'll figure out how to try to make it work, and you just don't want to put them in a situation where they're going to hurt themselves in trying to do that. You can pay a price after a while. But to your point, I think if you don't tell them that it's weird, they won't think it's weird. Right?
just to support the okay, go ahead.
Well, my question is just, I was reading something today about how, we spend so much time on technique, but, particularly with novice athletes, if you're not rigged correctly, you're basically going to grade a bad habit because they're going to try and adjust, to what the rigging is.
Yeah.
So when you're starting off with a novice crew who, what's the baseline? Super light,
I mean, for me, I would say super light because I just feel like teach them how to move the boat with effective, efficient, full-length strokes. Right? Give them a load that's really easy to manage, so that they are encouraged to seek for speed through length, right? Rather than just sort of hammering it through the middle and trying to yank on it. And that might be a little bit hard. You might be making sacrifices initially in terms of boat speed, right? Like that's the sort of if you're trying to get a crew up to speed in 2 months, then you might, if you have a not a very skilled or experienced crew, you might get more speed for a little while with a heavier rig. But if you're really trying to teach novices and develop them and not get them hurt and not teach them bad habits, I think learning how to row through full length arcs, right, the longest arc, is ultimately going to make them faster and more effective. So, you know, I mean, with our cruise, you know, the cruise I coach now, we start in the fall. We just start super light, you know, and then we just play around to see where we need to go from there.
So do you do that like this primarily with the spread or with the inboard?
Spread, all of the above, yeah. Spread, inboard, oar length. You know, we just, I mean, I can't tell you the last time that our oars moved off the shortest possible length adjustment, you know, and every time I order oars, I keep ordering shorter ones, so.
But a practical thing that sometimes like we, because I guess that boils down to like where do you want to get that leverage from, and if you're moving the pin in, you're going to obviously get a better catch angle, but at some point, if you're going to only have like a 113 inboard and you can only make your oars, if you're using a heavy blade like the ones that we have, we can only make them so short. This may be a question for Noel or for everybody, like you get to that point where you're getting the catch and then you're coming to the release, but the handle is so far over here because you're trying to get leverage to keep it light that everyone is kind of finishing on the opposite side of the boat because it's like 2 centimeters to the other side too much. Even when you use the clam, it's like pushes the athletes to, especially novices, because they just go wherever the end of the handle is. Like, oh, we're just gonna go, you know, right? So that would be. Does anyone have any ideas on that? Like, yeah, like in terms of if you like starting off with as light as you can get, and then you know if you're.
Again, just from personal experience, that's what I've done in the last 5 to 10 years is just I keep going shorter. I go as short as possible with the equipment I have, and then every time I order new equipment, I order shorter stuff.
Yeah.
But Bodie, if you're stuck with a certain length oar, then you just have to move the pin out as far as it would go to avoid the excess of inboard.
Right.
If you've got the button adjusted properly, but it all comes down to
If it's like 116 for the inboard, let's say, because it gives you but it gives you a much lighter load, right?
Right, but so then if you move the pin out, the oar won't be hanging off the inside as much. On the other hand, it'll be very hard to get much catch angle.
Right, because you're right. You're going to end up sort of catching
so you're
mid-drive.
You're stuck with an equipment problem.
I gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I think there's also some efficiency by pinching. Maybe there's a little bit of difference between angles between sculling and sweep, but the other thing that happens is if you put the blade in, let's say perpendicular to the boat, then you got to get the blade moving with boat speed. Yeah. Whereas if you catch it out here, it's easier to.
It's easier to put it in.
Yeah.
Because the water's essentially moving more slowly.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean that's another. You bring up a really interesting question. It's like, so I just pulled up this video of like the catch angle for a sweep boat, right? And it's different. But does it have to be, right?
No, it shouldn't have to be.
I mean that, that's you know that's where I'm going, right? I again watching a million scullers and thinking about like, okay, sculling is pretty efficient, pretty fast. Why shouldn't we try to sweep row more like scullers, right? And again, that video I put up of the Dutch 8, those guys are all scullers, right? And they tried to row the boat like a sculling boat. They tried to just get the sense of a moving system and just move it along. You know, this sort of led me down the path of saying, oh, I want my crews to sweep as much like scullers as I can, also to be able to move as much like 6'6" Olympic athletes as they can, and all of that leads me to thinking that we got to get out here, and if we have to make some sacrifices in other parts of the stroke, you know, maybe the stuff back here feels a little pinched. Okay, just take it out a little sooner. And I agree with you. I think the steeper an angle you put it in at, the easier it is to just put it in quietly. Because it just feels like there's nothing. There's nothing catching the bottom of the blade. You just sort of knife it in. You know, talk about sort of trying to use the leading edge of the blade as the thing that goes in the water, right? To think about catching that first, that leading edge, rather than the bottom edge chopping down. Think about knifing in this way. So again, the image that I think about is swimming too, of like, you know, swimming the butterfly, right? You sort of are
soft landing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Rather than hitting the water and trying to do something to the water, just put the blade in, put the airfoil or hydrofoil or whatever it is, put it in and let it sit there and move with the system, and then lean on it. Right. So
I'm just writing down some. So from the little deal here. Does everyone like? So I can hand some of these things out later. I didn't make enough copies because I didn't think there was going to be so many awesome people here. But this is from one of the books that we've used. I think you guys will use it for the IRL. It's what Dave sort of like uses to do most of his stuff. But just your general sort of club, sort of club college 8, men's lightweight 8, 374 on the overall length, 115 inboard, 85 on the centimeter in terms of spread. It says catch length, catch angle, 55 degrees. Yeah, so something like that would be like your standard baseline. Yeah.
So I just had a question because, I come to these and this is definitely like the biggest crowd that we've had for a while, right?
Yeah.
For one of these. Ooh. So I guess I was just wondering if people just wanted to say, like, what are their biggest rigging questions? Like, is it just like, I don't know where to start, or
thank you, CB.
Because for me, like, I coach a lot of scholars, and when I think about rigging an 8, I feel like kind of, sort of, I don't know where to start. I mean, I do, but I don't know where to start, so I always end up asking somebody else.
So, I mean, what I would do is just go to one of these chart things,
but
sort of,
Anyway, so I'm just wondering what other people have as questions. Like, I'm just wondering what's the combination that's too heavy, I don't know, what are people wondering?
Yeah, that's a great thing. Yeah. Luke, what are you wondering?
I'm wondering what the room sits on rigging for conditions. Like, we were out there yesterday on the Charles and the water is like molasses, and it's so slow.
Before the freeze.
And you can feel the drive is longer.
Double?
Yeah. So just the length of the stroke being in the water is longer because the water is so thick, right? So then we're going to go to Florida in 2 weeks, and the water is not going to be molasses. Like, changing the rig for not only temperature, but like if you're in a tailwind, do you rig lighter? Do you, I think that's where I stand. And how much
what you'd ultimately want is like a bike. You want to be able to just click shift your gearing
right
on the fly. Right? Index shifting, right?
Well, a lot of times all we do for practice is throw a clam on it, like get a headwind, put the clams on, great.
Well,
but that's not probably what we should do.
I mean, that changes everything.
But it's so hard to change the whole
again,
thing.
changing the rig is a big gamble because there's a lot of kind of athlete adaptations that have to be ready to happen. Your athletes have to not freak out.
Yeah. Well, plus you're going down and then you have to go back.
I do like the idea of not telling anyone, though. You can just make those changes when they go home, and then they just come back and everything looks the same, and then they just go out.
In terms of changing the rig for the water temperature, I wouldn't bother. I think if you can get it rigged to what you feel is optimal, just stick with it. The body's very adaptable. Because once you start changing things, the geometry changes very slightly. And if you're rowing enough to be at the elite level, you are tuned in to an unbelievable degree. And if you put a clam on or you do something different, you won't realize it, but you've changed your ability. So I would just leave it.
Physiologically.
And also proprioceptively as well.
Yeah.
So I would just leave it and, take it out a little earlier to finish if you want to achieve a certain rating.
Well, also just the awareness that you have that when you go into different conditions that the handle speed is going to be different, right? And that as long as you know that's going to happen and you're not surprised by it.
And same thing in a headwind, because if you're at a regatta, unless it's like, if it's strong enough, they probably cancel the regatta, okay? And if it's just really strong, just come out a little sooner at the finish to maintain your rating, maintain your catch angle, stay in the water a long time, come quick out and get back in again. And because once you start changing things at a regatta, you want to be focused on rowing hard and doing what you're normally feeling. I would be against the last minute change in general.
But I have a question about so in terms of coming up with just your your baseline, right? So, and you can kind of use the charts that have been established over time. But let's say is there a way to use if you're having erg data, right? Because that's one place that all coaches actually can get data is on the erg. But can you use a peak power on slides or average 1 minute or some way of a power output that can help figure out what your gear actually might be?
I mean that's why the Kleshnev's calculator is so interesting because it's sort of an attempt to do that.
Okay.
Right. Of you can put in your athletes, the boat type, the gender, height, skill, sort of ability level, elite, junior, collegiate, whatever it is, and then average erg time or 2K time on the water,
Okay.
and then it basically kicks back numbers. It's a little funky, and it produces some strange numbers sometimes, but it can be an interesting place to at least start your thinking.
Does anyone does everyone know what that is? That little calculator thing? No, BioRow. Yeah, you don't know.
I don't know what it is.
Okay. Yeah, so it's you can just go to BioRow.
It was
Bio.com.
offline.
It was.
It was
I
offline.
just looked at it today because he said it's now up again. You can take a look at it.
Yeah, because he was having some bugs or something, because the numbers it was spitting out last summer were not making a whole lot of sense.
And
But
they
it's,
have a radio
Also,
chart.
going crazy.
I would look at his charts rather than using the
charts,
calculator,
yeah.
because the charts are very reasonable, and he's got two sets. One is his crazy charts, and one is his reasonable charts. And I'm not sure. I've used that BioRow calculator quite a bit, and I'm never sure if it's kicking out the right stroke rating. It's a little crazy.
Yeah, the interface is kind of funky, but it is interesting as sort of the charts are interesting too as a starting point for sure. And when I started looking at that, it just made me start to realize, like, oh, I really have been rigged too heavy almost always, right? And that going lighter is, at least worth the experiment.
Well, I think the close enough thing also gives you an estimate of how much time it would take you to cover the course, doesn't it?
Yeah.
As far as, So it's that's one way of like how fast can my crew go down the course? Are they anywhere near that? And if not, maybe like why not?
Other burning questions?
Yeah.
Big rigging problems? Areas that make no sense?
You guys got it all figured out from Connecticut.
Well, I'll bring up a pet peeve I have.
Oh yeah, that's another one. Well, that's like a rigging disaster, but or something
so,
like that you hear all the time. That
it seems like most of the 8 manufacturers are putting out boats with pins at 0 outward pitch.
Yeah.
And if you watch a lot of
lateral
HRO,
pitch. Yeah.
0 outward pitch or lateral pitch. And so what 1 degree of lateral pitch will give you is the ability to stay on top of the water at the catch and keep it buried more easily at the finish. And if you watch a lot of 8's row, they're going too deep at the catch and popping out too early at the finish. So I think that could be solved with 1 degree of outward pitch.
I was just going to say, I wanted to talk about pitch, because I feel like pitch has changed when I was younger, you would rig your lateral pitch, and then you would rig the rest of your pitch, so that you would get your change through your stroke, and now people don't do that anymore, and I feel like we've lost something. Everybody get that?
Yeah, so the idea is like if this is your hull and you're trying to take a look at, the pitch of the actual metal pin that is going to help keep the blade or keep the shaft sort of aligned with the water.
It allows you to grab the water a little better at the catch and release the water a little easier
Well,
at the
it
finish.
keeps the blade superficial at the catch, and it keeps it buried at the finish.
Yeah. And so, but you're right.
If you have outward
They're
pitch,
all.
right.
That's true. Well, the Resolutes that had the one that like a swivel thing that you could do whatever you want with it, which is pretty complicated, especially if the shims got all worn out. You couldn't really set it. And then the newer ones, like the ones that we just got, they're just all 0.
And you can put a shim under the pin to get a degree of outward pitch. Or you
Oh,
can
that's
put,
true,
Or you
yeah.
can put some shims on the boat. But then if people are de-rigging it, re-rigging, and they don't know,
Right.
so if you put it under the pin itself,
Right.
that can solve the problem. But sometimes that can slip out. So.
Yeah.
What about pin inserts, oral lock inserts? Don't those adjust the pitch with relative
The concept
to the...
to or lock swivels.
Yes.
For the aft, but not outward.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Right, so that would be us looking at the side of the boat and adjusting. So if we were looking at the boat this way, right, then, and the blade, so this would probably be a little bit hard to draw, but like that's your shaft, right? So you're thinking like the actual angle this way as it goes through the water, right? Like does it actually stay at the same angle kind of thing?
Okay.
Right, so that would be your oar-lock pitch, that 4-degree built-in sort of stuff right there. We had definitely a little bit of a, and I don't, maybe Nolan knows a little bit about this too, but and Carl's not here, but our oars, the collars, maybe Kane can sort of talk to this because I'm not exactly sure, but and John, you remember having to re-sleeve all of our oars because over time the shafts unwind. So like we have a lot of, we're hoping to get some newer oars, but apparently like if you've got oars that are 10 years old, like 10, 12 years old, the sleeves, right, will actually start to like not clock at the zero degree mark.
C2 recommends every, like, especially if it's a new set, every year or every 2 years.
Re-sleeve them.
Yeah,
That's
on
a
new
big,
ones
it's a
they
big
say
job.
after your first year check it.
Yeah.
And, I found that the hard way. I
And,
raised Charles with my port like almost 3 years.
They make a pitch measurement device, so you can check it without
Right.
changing it if you don't need to.
Okay.
And it's a big metal thing.
Yeah,
It
we
sets
have.
down.
Yeah. In fact, if we went down, if we were in the shop tonight, there's a whole slew of oars with all sleeves off because we're in the process of trying to re-sleeve everything.
That's what I did 2 years ago before I had Charles. We had 2-year-old blades. I went down and like 6 of 8 pitches on the newer blades are all off.
Yeah.
Was it more than 1 degree?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what we
If it was
noticed.
1 degree, I left it.
Yeah, right, because it was close enough.
The other thing you have to watch out for is wear on the sleeve itself.
Do you know?
Yep.
Right, so this sort of the idea that the oar itself is supposed to have a 0 degree pitch, like where the collar sits, but as it unwinds. So what I'd be out like looking at the novice crews rowing or crew lead or whatever, and you'd see that people would put the oar in. This is kind of the idea of if the rig is wrong, not wrong, but like if something is not right, like our sculling stuff for a while, like, you know, the person will put the oar in the water and they'll lift their shoulders, not because that's actually the way they're going, but because the blade is literally digging into the water. It's not holding perpendicular to the water line. So like whenever I would see girls who were rowing, and the first thing that they would do is catch the water and move upwards with the shoulders, I'd start looking at the blade on the feather, and you could see that as the blade was feathered and moving toward the bow of the boat, it was actually tilted down, like the front edge of the blade was tilted down toward the water. And that told me right away that as soon as it went back on the square, it was like the opposite pitch. So the blade would just dig into the water like a, yeah.
I shouldn't tell everybody this, but Concept 2 will re-pitch your blades at you sign up in advance. You go to their site at almost any major regatta. They're there. You let them know in advance. You can bring in, and that's what we wound up doing at Heather Charles.
They do it all day.
Shuffle them down there.
Yeah.
And they've changed the way that they wind their
do
blades
it,
over
yeah.
the years,
It's
so
got-
that they're
right.
less,
They fixed it.
less prone
There-
to.
There was actually a
to
really
change.
brief quality control problem they had with the carbon that they were using, and there was a brief like 6-month run of oars about 15 years ago where they actually were very temperature sensitive. So if you left your oars out in the sun, it would cause the weave of the carbon to move, and so your pitch would change in the sunshine. So they recalled those to come back. But I was just smiling because the whole topic of pitch makes me just. We're talking about why you wouldn't tell athletes things. I always hated it when my college rowers figured out about pitch because they would start complaining about their pitch being off. And I would say, all right, I'll bet you $20 that your pitch is not off by more than a degree, and it rarely was. But so from a coaching standpoint, it was I got very impatient with rowers who were kind of giving me the Princess and the Pea act of like, my pitch is interfering with my ability to row correctly, and it's pilot error most of the time. That said, I have been humbled a couple of times by athletes who complained bitterly that there was a pitch problem, and I dismissed it, and then finally they wore me down, and I went and checked it, and they were right. In one case, a woman came to Craftberry with a brand new boat from an unnamed, very, very, very high-end boat manufacturer, like literally unwrapped it at Craftsbury, and rode all week and was complaining about the pitch of one of her riggers being off. And I sort of checked the easy stuff like the pitch inserts and things like that, and after a while I was like, okay, I'm just going to measure this, and lo and behold, the rigger was defective. It had either been damaged in transit or something, but it was off by like 3 or 4 degrees. So I felt like a dummy.
The other thing I would say is that I had this experience in coaching Nate one time where we went through a lot of the spring racing season, and one of the very tall women has had different body dimensions than some of the others, and she was a strong athlete and paid close attention and had everything else going for her, but she could not keep the blade in the water through the finish of the stroke. And it was also throwing off the port starboard set of the boat as well. And even though her pitches were the same as everybody else, I just bit the bullet and just made it work for her by giving her 2 degrees less pitch, and that solved the problem both in this way and in her own blade. So if nothing else is working, don't be afraid to take one athlete, and if you can find somebody that works for them, go ahead and do it.
Right.
One thought of that, if she was a lot taller than the others, it could have been that she was pulling, like, her arm could have been, like, down instead of, like, straighter than the others. So she could have actually been pulling up on her oar handle and sort of, like, tilting the boat because of the way that...
Except she was coming out through the back half of the stroke. And she tended to pull the opposite way.
Okay.
That's my favorite
That's different then. Okay. And she was...
It's funny because I really agree with you. I think like this whole thing of not being afraid to experiment and to try to make some tweaks to see if it helps. If you've got a persistent problem that won't go away otherwise, I think that's really an important thing to be open to, right? To be brave enough to sort of step out of whatever the orthodox pattern is supposed to be.
You can always change it back.
You can always change it back. But the flip side of that I also warn people against sometimes when they're starting to learn about rigging is just change one thing at a time. Right? Don't drive yourself crazy by changing a bunch of variables because, as you said in an earlier comment, especially if you're tuned in, even one change is going to make things feel really different in a lot of unpredictable ways, and you got to get used to that for a while, right? And if you're not giving yourself time to evaluate the change, or if you're changing so many variables that you really have no idea what's causing what, you can easily get yourself into a rigging hall of mirrors and drive yourself nuts.
A related point that you made earlier, which I support, is the body's very adaptable on the one hand, but if you're trying to test different rigs or something and you're trying to do like back-to-back pieces, realize that the results you're going to get are only partially a result of the rigging change, but probably as much or more so a product of what your body is used to doing in terms of its velocity of motion and the amount of pressure it's used to taking. So it's very hard to get a valid result by making a significant change on a couple pieces one day, because the body will adapt to whatever you've changed, and you may need to give it weeks or a month to adapt to that change to really figure out if it is advantageous or not. So it's very dangerous to do back-to-back testing with radical changes.
Well, that's what Modi was talking about before. How do you evaluate stuff? And I would just encourage people to, if you have the ability to collect speed data, like collect it all the time, right? Look at what your crew is doing on all the time, and so that then you can really, it's like checking your pulse and your temperature on a daily basis. You can tell if things are off a little bit, and then you can start to speculate as to why. But yeah, any one piece or any one day compared with any other day is going to be almost meaningless because there's so many variables that are hard to figure out. Right. But yeah, you can see trends over time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because there are so many variables. There's no doubt about that for sure.
Another comment with the pitch being off is be aware of one oarlocks in the sense that with the concept 2 blades, you have little. The back of the shaft is not flat like it used to be at one time. Mm-hmm. It's grooved. So when it works in the oar lock, it tends to not makes grooves in different spots, so that if you put a pitch meter up against it and you're not measuring the actual spot where the oar is resting against if it's grooved out. And so you might be trying to set an oar lock for the flat on the oar as opposed to the groove, so you actually could be setting the oar pitch, like you might be thinking, I'm setting it right, but you're actually setting it wrong.
Right, based on a worn out part.
Alright, since you called me out. My question is, do you change your load at all for, spring type workouts versus fall type workouts? Because it's
That's a good question.
state.
Very good. See? Go Yukon.
Is that for me? For me, I sort of dial things in more and more as the spring races approach. I always try to use the fall season as a kind of development and skill development season, and so the lineups are changing all the time. We don't have set lineups for very long, if at all. The goals are really to learn the movement and to sort of ancillary way to develop fitness over time, but really it's about boat moving skill and boat awareness. We spent a lot of time in singles. And then, as we shift over into the 8s in the spring and we get closer and closer to set lineups, I'm going to start to dial it in a little bit differently. I used to have the load heavier in the fall because the rates were lower, and I sort of thought, we need to be able to thump it. And now I just sort of have come to the feeling that getting used to a certain kind of handle speed and a certain relationship with the moving system is probably more advantageous. So I've gone to keeping the rigs light almost throughout the year, and we row pretty high when we race all the time, right? So we don't. As our aerobic fitness has gotten better, we don't think of the rates in the head races as being that different from the rates in the sprint races in the spring, and it's just a slightly different mindset about how long you're going to suffer. So, I think what you were saying about sort of getting used to the handle speed and the relationship of that seems to have advantages to me. But I will tune the rig a little bit and tune the gearing a little bit for the crew. Like if I have a stronger crew or a weaker crew, my crew last year was tiny and light. They trained their hearts out, and the only way they were going to get anywhere was to row really high. So that was what we did. We rigged really light.
I coach sculling and juniors, and so I probably tended to change it more. Well, I adjust the length depending on how tall the kid is, as well as their power, inboard and outboard. And as a kid grows, that changes. So, like if the kid grows, puts on 3 inches, I'm going to make the oar longer, more than likely, as the person is growing. So I find myself changing, like trying to keep up with as they're growing and changing in height, changing their, keep an eye on, like, hey, do I need to do something different with them?
Cool. All right, you guys, how about we keep the pizzas here? I'd like to actually, I have these little handouts that I kind of made. I can make more copies because they didn't expect them. But we have some for the men and some for the women. It's just so if you don't have this sort of book, I can make more copies of these, and I'll just leave them out sort of over here so that you guys can grab what you like.
What is the resource called?
The resource was Purser's book, I guess.
Oh, okay.
This little guy.
Yeah.
So.
I've been reading it.
Yeah, I guess that's critical too, right?
Well,
It's still here. It's in my
Yeah.
room.
So I just
hard
stole
to-
Dave's
it's not-
book
it's
and
not fast
made copies. So, but this might give you like the baseline stuff. I'm sure if you guys have it, you can, whatever. But that might be helpful. And then I also have another little one just in here on like, how about the order? Like when you're going to get ready to rig, there's like the order in here of what you guys want to do in terms of like going from soup to nuts. Because I know like when you set up car stuff, you have to actually set the camber first and then the caster after that. You can't set them both at the same time, and that's very similar to pitch. You kind of have to just make sure you're doing like the correct sequence so that all the measurements end up like correct at the end, so you don't have to go back and do other stuff before that, right? So, yeah. Cool. All right, well, how about we just, let's eat. I'll go get some more beer because I actually have some downstairs. Noel, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and actually, thank you very much. We just really want to keep that idea of like the exchange of stuff because like, we all go through the same issues. We all have time limitations, equipment limitations. Like, right? We're all just trying to sort of figure it out, and it certainly helps to sort of have like a whatever.
Yeah, I want to second that. It's very cool to have a whole bunch of people in the room to talk about this stuff, which I've been obsessing about in my lonely little island for a long time. I feel less crazy. Thank you.